Okay, so welcome back to lifespan development. So this is week 1, module 2. So in this module, we're going to be looking at the different research methods that would be used in developmental or lifespan psychology. So we already mentioned in the last module the 4 different goals of psychology. So just a little refresher. So the first goal is to describe the behavior that you're seeing. The second goal would be to explain it. The third goal would be then to predict when it's going to occur in the future. And then the fourth goal would be to control or influence that behavior, or for the purpose of developmental psychology, that development. So suppose we want to find out whether memory declines with age. Think to yourself how we would go about answering that question. So how would you use those 4 goals to look at the declining memory as we age? So there's different research methods that could be used to study that question, or to study that, or to kind of dive deep into that question. So one of the first research methods would be variable research. So variables are characteristics that vary from person to person. So such as physical size, intelligence, personality, those would all be examples of variables. So when 2 or more variables vary together, that indicates that there's some sort of relationship. So for instance, in that question that we just talked about, so does memory decline with age? Age would be one variable and memory would be another variable. So if we do a study, and we're going to go through the different ways that we could study this as we progress through this module, we would look at the idea that as somebody ages, that's one variable, you would see a decline in memory would be the second variable there. So and if you do see that, so as someone's age increases, their memory decreases, that's a relationship. So if you see that across individuals and across populations, we would recognize that there's a relationship between those 2 variables. So researchers study development using both descriptive methods of research and then also experiments. So as we go through this module, we're going to look at the different descriptive methods and then also experimental research as well. So for descriptive methods, we have listed here that there's case studies as an option, naturalistic observation, and also surveys. So I'm just going to sneak ahead here and see what type of okay, so we don't have, all right, just wanted to see what the slides looked like. So for case studies, that's one descriptive method. So a case study is an in-depth examination of single individuals. And so case studies can be really, really helpful when trying to explore influences on development. The issue with case studies is that they can't be generalized. So for instance, I'm not sure if I'm going to show you this documentary, but some of you may have seen it before or heard of it. But in the past, I've showed this documentary called Genie, The Secrets of the Wild Child. And in this documentary, it explores an extreme case of child abuse. So there was a young girl, and they gave her the name Jeannie, so that wasn't her real name, but for the purposes of protecting her identity, that's the name that they gave her. And what happened was she was tied to what they call the potty chair and neglected until she was 6 years old when they discovered her. And Jeannie was nonverbal. So she couldn't communicate. She had never learned a language. And so what researchers did, so it's a pretty horrible case, but what they did was they wanted to study to understand if there is a point in development where a first language has to be learned by. So they were looking at, can somebody who's never been exposed to language learn a language later? So what they believe is that there is a developmental shift that occurs that makes it difficult to learn a language past a certain age. And so they studied her for a few years to see if she could acquire language the way you would expect an individual to acquire language. So the issue or the benefit of case studies is that they were able to get a lot of information on Jeannie and to see how she acquired language and how that influenced her development. So that's a great way to gather a lot of information. But the downfall of case studies is that you can't generalize that. Right? So you can't necessarily say that if a child doesn't learn a first language by the age of 6, then they won't be able to acquire language later. And there's no way to replicate that research. So you're not going to have a just like it would be unethical, which I believe we'll talk about in another module what ethics are, but it would be completely unethical to take a child and put them in isolation for 6 years and then see what results they had if you tried to replicate that research. So the issue with case studies is that you can't replicate them and you can't generalize them to other people. So you don't know how someone else would respond in that situation. And it's not always, it's not something that you can just try and have somebody else like complete that kind of replicate that situation. So you can get a lot of information, so they can be really useful that way, but you can't replicate or generalize that data. So when psychologists use naturalistic observation, which is another descriptive method, they would observe people in their normal environments. So with naturalistic observation, you have the benefit of people potentially being more comfortable, but there's also a few downfalls. So I would say examples I gave in the past for my students were, say, pre-COVID, you were in a class, in my classroom, physically in the building at Sioux College. I could say to you, okay, so there's a researcher that's coming in and they're going to look at classroom behaviors and see if it's correlated with academic success. So a researcher is going to come in the classroom and they're going to just observe you throughout the term. And then at the end of the year, they're going to see how well you do in the course. So they might look at your cell phone use. So are you paying attention when we're in class, or are you on Instagram, or are you texting your friends, or are you looking at TikTok or things like that? They might look at your note-taking skills. They might look at how much you're participating in the classroom, things like that. And then they would see, okay, so this person really was quite distracted in class, and this was their grade at the end of the semester. So that is a way that would be something that a study that you could do. The downfall of naturalistic observation is if you know that you're being observed, you might act differently when you know someone's watching you. So say you know that this experiment or this study or this descriptive method research is taking place in lifespan development, you might act completely different in my class than you would act in a different class because you know somebody's watching you. So sometimes that can skew the data. Another method of research or a descriptive method would be surveys. So you have probably completed a survey at some point in your life. And this involves using either interviews or questionnaires to gather information. So one of the pros of surveys is you can get a lot of information in a really short amount of time, and they're really cost effective. So you will potentially this semester be completing a survey on how just a course evaluation survey. So it would ask you questions like, how helpful did you find the book? Was I effective in delivering content to you? So they would ask you those questions. So there's been lots of different studies that they've done over the years. And so there's one example that I have. So what they did was they did a survey to ask people, how often do you wash your hands after using the restroom? So they asked a large sample of people. They asked in cities across the United States, they asked them, how frequently do you wash your hands after using the bathroom? And in the survey, people said that they always washed their hands after they used the restroom. So 100% of the time, I wash my hands. So then what they did was they had researchers go into public restrooms across these cities where they had done these surveys, and they just watched people. So they watched people's bathroom use, like watched people see if they washed their hands once they went to the washroom. And what they found out was that was not the case. So people were saying, I always wash my hands 100% of the time. But then when they actually watched people, they found out that, people actually don't wash their hands after they use the restroom 100% of the time. So that can be another issue with surveys is that there can be response bias. So people might respond in a way that they believe is socially acceptable. So we all know that we should be washing our hands after we use the washroom. So when you're asked this question, you say, yes, actually, I do wash my hands all the time. But when they actually go ahead and study this, they find that that is not the case. So people don't always answer truthfully in surveys, which can also skew data. Okay, so next we will talk about correlation research. And so I'm just going to scroll up a little bit here so you can see the whole slide here. But what correlation research would look at is they would decide if there's relationships between two variables. So, and then they would look at the strength of those relationships. So I believe the first question that they asked at the beginning of this module was, does memory decline with age? So they would want to just, each of those, memory is one variable and age would be another variable. So they're trying to study if there's a correlation there. So is there a relationship between these two variables? So relationships can be, or correlations are expressed in a range. So you have -1 to +1. So -1 would mean that that's a perfect negative correlation, and +1 would mean that's a perfect positive correlation. And so very rarely in research would you ever see perfect correlations. So a correlation, if you got a number of 0, it would indicate that there is no correlation between those two variables. So when you look at the difference between a positive and negative correlation, a positive correlation means that when one variable increases, so does the other variable. So for a perfect positive correlation, when you're, so I'm trying to think here. So the variables, does memory increase with age? Okay, or decrease with age. Say they found that there was a positive correlation there. What that would mean is one variable increases, so does the other variable. So a positive correlation would mean that when someone ages, their memory actually increases. So when age goes up, memory goes up. What you might predict that you would find is a negative correlation between memory and age. So as somebody's age increases, their memory decreases. So that's how I think of correlation. So a negative correlation means that as one variable increases, the other variable decreases. So there's a relationship. A positive correlation means as one variable increases, the other variable also increases. So for instance, say we were looking at positive correlation, we're looking at correlation, between studying and test grades. So you might predict that there would be a positive correlation between the amount of time that you study and the grades that you're going to receive on your next test. So as time, one variable would be studying. So as studying increases, the other variable, which would be test scores, would also increase, right? So you would see a positive relationship between those two variables. You might expect to see a negative correlation between grades and time spent partying. So as you party more, one variable goes up, your grades go down. So you would see a negative correlation. So when you're thinking of correlation research, a positive correlation means that when one variable increases, so does the other variable. A negative correlation means that when one variable increases, the other variable decreases. So one thing to remember with correlation research is that correlations have limitations. So a correlation does not equal causation. So what that means is that you might be able to identify a relationship between two variables, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one variable causes the other variable. So you might say that for the example of time spent partying and grades, you might say that really when somebody's grades go down, they party more to try to take their mind off of it, or partying more causes your grades to go down. You can't necessarily indicate which one causes the other. So in order to explore that further, you would have to do an experiment. So correlation research just says that there's a relationship there, but it doesn't necessarily say which causes what, right? So correlation does not equal causation. So that's what that means. So just a little refresher. There goes my parents' cuckoo clock. I'm recording in my parents' basement right now as they watch my children. But A positive correlation means that when one variable increases, the other variable also increases. A negative correlation means that when one variable increases, the other decreases. However, reminder that correlation does not equal causation, so you can't necessarily say what causes what. All right. So in order to explore causation, a researcher would use an experiment. So an experiment is a study that usually tests a hypothesis to see if something is going to happen. So a key feature of an experiment is that participants are assigned randomly to participate in one of the several groups. So chance determines which group the researcher places each participant in. So for instance, when I was in university, there was an experiment. So I didn't take place in this study, but I did go into other studies. But however, so they did an experiment to see if alcohol increased risk-taking behaviors. So what they did was they had people come into a laboratory, and they had a control group. And then they had a placebo group, which means that they didn't actually receive alcohol. And then they had a group that was receiving the alcohol. So what they did was they gave some people alcohol, some people no alcohol, and then they gave some people what they thought was alcohol, but it actually wasn't. And then they measured like risk taking through like these gambling exercises to see if alcohol actually influenced if you were more likely to take greater risks. So that would be an example of an experiment. So their hypothesis was that alcohol would increase risk-taking behavior. And this is actually something they have studied across, not just in this experiment, but we're going to talk about this later on in the semester when we look at safe sex practices in adolescence and also in early adulthood and late adulthood. And they found that as people drink more alcohol, they're less likely to engage in safe sex. So they're actually taking greater risks. So we do know that alcohol can make lower people's inhibitions, and it can make people take greater risks. But that was just an experiment that was taking place on campus. So research designs for studying age-related changes, there's a few different designs that they would use. So in a cross-sectional design, groups of participants are selected at each of a series of ages. So say they wanted to study, we'll use what's occurring right now. So we're in the middle of a pandemic. So everybody's heard of COVID-19 is pretty much all that has been on the news for the last few months. But they might say, how does COVID-19 influence somebody's mental health? So a cross-sectional study would say we're going to look at how COVID-19 is influencing mental health across the age spectrum. So you might look at like early childhood. So they might have young children in the study, seeing how is COVID-19 influencing a child's like mental health, and they might say, okay, we're going to have elementary school age children, and then we're going to have high school, and we're going to have early, middle, and late adulthood, and then see how COVID-19 is influencing mental health. So that would be a cross-sectional design, meaning that you have groups of participants at different ages all being studied at the same time. Then you have longitudinal designs. So this would be a design that would follow the individual over a period of time. So for instance, they might look at how access to social media influences somebody's development across their lifetime. So you might start young children in the study, and you would take those young children and you would follow how social media is impacting their development from the time that they start the study until potentially like 30, 40 years from the time the study starts. So one pro of that is that you can gather information across somebody's lifespan, but the con is that sometimes people drop out of the study. It's obviously very time consuming, and it can be difficult to track individuals. A sequential design begins with at least two age groups. So investigators test each group over a number of years with two types of comparisons. So they would have two different age groups, and then they would test those groups over time. So it's a mixture between cross-sectional and longitudinal research. So you're looking at different ages across a span of at least 2 years. So here's just a chart that you can read through that looks at the advantages and the limitations of cross-sectional. So that's meaning you're studying different groups of people, different age groups of different people of different ages, groups of people at different ages across all at one time. Okay, let me say that one more time. You have different ages of people all being studied at the same time. Longitudinal, you have one group of people being studied over a span of time, and then sequential is a mixture of both of those. And then there's just some charts there that I will let you read through. All right. Oh man, this really influenced. Loading it to LMS has changed the formatting of these PowerPoints. Okay, so cross-cultural research is important to developmental psychology for two different reasons. It can identify both cultural specific changes and then also universal changes. So for instance, some things that would be of interest to cross-cultural research, they might look at something like retirement. So when we get to late adulthood, we'll be looking at retirement, and that is actually a Western phenomenon. So that's something that in different cultures, you don't necessarily see people retiring in every single culture. However, there are universal changes that we can study. So when you look at physical development of young children, it's a very sequential pattern, and you can expect to see a specific sequence of physical developmental changes that occur no matter what culture the individual is living in. So for instance, when you think of a young baby, usually babies first roll from their front to their back, and then they roll back to front, and then they learn to sit up, and then they learn to pull themselves to standing, and then they walk. So you see this like developmental pattern that occurs. Crawling is actually not a developmental milestone, although many babies do crawl. There are some that actually do not crawl, but you would expect to see that sequence of physical development happening in every single culture globally around the world. It's not something that's going to be influenced by culture, but then you also see cultural changes changes that occur in specific cultures that don't always occur in other cultures. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about on this in this module is research ethics. So when psychologists are researching, they have to follow a code of ethics. So I gave you the example of Jeannie the Wild Child and Secrets of the Wild Child. That is something that you could never do. You cannot isolate a child for 6 years, neglect them, and then see how that influences their development. So that's not ethical. And researchers do have a code of ethics that they must follow. So they must protect the research participants from harm. So that means that you can't knowingly harm a research participant. So that would be, with the example that I just gave, obviously that would be physically and emotionally and psychologically very harmful. So you couldn't do that. Informed consent means that you have to let the individual know like what they're signing up for. So you can't tell somebody that they're signing up for a study that's going to study their research. So I'll give the example that I used earlier, their classroom habits and their grades. You can't tell somebody that you can't tell someone that they're signing up for that study and then actually measure how their physical appearance influences their social media use. You can't do that, right? So you have to tell the person what they're signing up for. And if you have to deceive that individual at the end of the study, because it would influence the outcome of the study, you would have to fully explain that deception. Confidentiality, so all the results must remain confidential, and knowledge of the results, you have to let the person know like the outcome of the study. So those would be the different research ethics that developmental psychologists would use when they are studying human development. So that's it for chapter 1, module 2.